Let me go ahead and get started. I'd like to be sure and cover the topic for this week, which is flooding, and then talk also just a little bit about what our assignments are for the upcoming week. First of all, I'm sorry about the problems that we had with the FEMA online testing site. Hopefully that should be cleared up today when they do the updates of the system. But again, if it becomes a lingering problem that lasts for more than the next couple of days, we'll come back and revisit that issue. So assignments due this week, there's a quiz that's specific to this particular presentation. And although there's quite a few slides in this presentation, I'm only going to hit the highlights of it. Certainly there's more content here if you want to go back and look at it. And I have included some videos as a part of the Moodle landing site for this week's assignment, just to also help reinforce probably one of the biggest challenges we have in terms of disaster operations and disaster preparedness, certainly in the state of Louisiana, is flooding. And while we tend to think about hurricanes and some of the other challenges that we face, really the greatest substantial threat, even in the face of dealing with a hurricane, is actually flooding. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the course, and I do have a couple of slides today where we'll talk a little bit more about some of the details of why that is. So without anything further, let me be sure and look at. I also did include a video of a professor from LSU who he's a bit of an alarmist, but does talk about the possibility of the challenge should there be a diversion at the Atchafalaya, what's called the old river. But so there's a diversion, there's a system of diverting water out of the Mississippi that was set up north of Baton Rouge, and a part of it is to be sure that about a third of the water goes into the Atchafalaya Basin, but then the other 2/3 stay in the Mississippi River Basin. And a part of that is because if that diversion didn't take place, the Atchafalaya is actually more of a straight shot to the Gulf and more of a downhill flow. And it was believed, and most hydrogeologists will tell you that the Atchafalaya would become the primary channel for the Mississippi River, which has catastrophic effects for anything south of there, and specifically anything south between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. So it certainly is a video worth watching, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. But I would also tell you that most of the people who are also the experts in that field assure me that it's a little bit more of an alarmist view, but it's certainly a view that's out there that I think you need to know about. Okay. And then obviously there's there's a discussion forum this week about flooding events that I've included. But without anything further, let me change the screen that I'm sharing and move to, let's see, move to that one. Oh, that's not the one I want to share. That's the one I want to share. Okay. So again, part of the challenge we have here in New Orleans in particular is we are prone to flooding for a number of reasons. Number one, the city is surrounded by water. Number two, more than 50% of the city itself is below sea level. So what would normally be gravitational runoff where water runs downhill. There's not a lot of place for it to run downhill, so we have to pump it. And although we have substantial pumping capacity, obviously it can be overwhelmed pretty quickly. And then there's a lot of non-porous surfaces. There's been a lot of paving that's been done through the years. And because they're non-porous surfaces, it means the water doesn't really have much of a place to be absorbed. Instead, it runs off. And then the last comment I'll make about that is even where it does run off, the distance between the level of the soil and the water table is actually very shallow. And so there's not a lot of soil in between the water table and the surface to absorb extra water and runoff. So again, we're kind of back to the point of the challenges we have associated with flooding. Key terms I want to be sure and talk about: storm surge, flood watch, flash flood watch, flood warning, and flash flood warning. And just to, again, the difference between a watch and a warning. With a watch, conditions are favorable. With a warning, conditions are actually occurring. A flood watch versus a flash flood watch. A flash flood means it can occur very quickly and may last for an extended period of time. Flash flood warnings and flash flood watches are more likely to be associated with heavy rainfall and could be associated with coastal flooding or associated with tropical weather, such as a hurricane or a tropical storm. And then a storm surge obviously is associated with that forward push that precedes a hurricane making landfall. And again, as we've talked about with storm surge, there's two actions in place that lead to the type of damage that we see with storm surge. Number one is, again, this massive storm that in a circular manner is lifting water to some extent. And then the second piece is because of the constant wind flow over top of the water, it's pushing it forward. And the best example I can offer is holding a cup of water or a cup of coffee and blowing across the top of it. Normally it's level until you blow across the top of it, and then you can push water out or coffee out or whatever out the other side of the cup. And that gives you an idea of at least what's going on with storm surge. So there's something that I also included called an AROS or a wash, and it's a water card gully. It's more likely to develop in the western states. That's not something that we typically find really Texas and east of the Mississippi, but I did include it just to be sure that again, depending on what part of the country you choose to live in at some point in your life, there are other areas out there where there's normally dry creek beds. There's not a lot of rainfall, but when they have a lot of rainfall in a short period of time, because the soil is so baked and packed, they have a lot of runoff. And when those areas are hit by a sudden substantial amount of rainfall, they have significant flash flooding associated with that. Geology and geography are things that help us understand the context of what causes a flood, what areas are more likely to be associated with a flood. With geology, we're talking about the Earth's physical structure, history, processes that help us understand soil composition, as an example. Sand absorbs a lot of water. Clay does not absorb a lot of water. But it's through geology that the science of geology help us understand soil compositions. Geography is physical features or physical characteristics of the earth. And the best way to think about geography is how we measure it. And although I don't think I have the word listed, but that's topography. and that's the rise and fall of geography. But again, geography is helping us understand the physical features. And ice jam is obviously something we're not going to deal a lot with here in the New Orleans area, but it does talk about how as pieces of ice form on a large body of water and then break up and start moving downstream, that ice jam can lead to a sudden damming of water and then a backflow and flooding behind the ice jam. I've got a couple of images as examples of that. And then inundation is really talking about the depth of water over what would normally be dry land, whether we're talking about with tides or surge or maybe even with a tsunami. River flood and soil percolation. The main point I would make about river flooding is just understand how what the seasonal nature is of river flooding. We're more likely to see that with the spring rainfall than we are most any other period of time. There can be some river flooding associated with tropical weather, of course, but those are the two primary times that we're most concerned about river flooding. And then soil percolation helps us understand how much absorption the water, how much the soil will be able to absorb the water. If you live in a rural area of Louisiana or pick another state, you won't have access to sewer services, or in most cases, you won't have access to sewer services. So they have to install a septic tank at your house. It's a large concrete tank. All of the waste from the house is connected to this concrete tank. And then at a high level in the tank, they dig lines that that come off the end of the tank, and they set up this field of lines, and the lines have holes in them, and it's plastic pipe with holes in it. And so the purpose is solid waste will sink to the bottom of the tank, and liquid waste will rise to the top of the tank, and liquid waste will then drain out into this field of lines. And those lines have they pour lots of gravel and then fill dirt over top of it and put grass over top of it. But the way to figure out how many lines you need and how long the lines need to be is something called a soil percolation test. And what you're doing is you're looking at how much water will the soil absorb, or in some cases, like with clay, if it doesn't absorb water very well, it means you wind up having to dig for a greater number of lines and put a greater distribution field to be able to use your septic tank. Storm surge, we've talked about before. Topography, I mentioned earlier, that's how we measure and look at the arrangement of natural and artificial features. The best way to think about topography is if I'm here at the university and I'm driving across the land barrier between here and Lake Pontchartrain, that topography rises as I go across that earth berm and then falls once I get closer to Lake Pontchartrain. Well, topography is also a way that we measure the rise and fall and gives us an idea of how the sea level is at the same level as Lake Pontchartrain, but topography also tells us that level is much lower than the Mississippi River. And then urban flooding. Again, part of the challenges with urban flooding come back to the point that there's a lot of non-pervious material that's used. We pave a lot of areas, and because we pave a lot of areas, it doesn't allow water to naturally be absorbed into the soil, because again, it's been covered by this impervious coverage, and leads to areas that are more prone to urban flooding. And then the water table is, again, that area of saturation. It's where water can be found once you dig down through several layers of soil. In some places, the water table may be very deep. It may be 75, 100, 150 foot deep. In some places, the water table is actually very close to the surface, and maybe closer to 20 feet, 25 feet. So if we look at historical disasters, floods actually lead as the top two most significant historical disasters in terms of lives lost. And what that really tells us, this is from the 1930s and the 1880s. It also affects a couple of areas in China. And again, what that really tells us is areas with dense population and poor warning systems, and certainly they didn't have warning systems at that particular time, but just what type of catastrophic event can occur from flooding, particularly with flash flooding or substantial flooding with little or no warning or no notice. So let's talk just a little bit about facts about flooding. And again, these are things that I've mentioned just a little bit before as it relates to New Orleans. It is the most common hazard in the United States. Some develop more slowly, some develop quickly. As you think back over some of your experiences here in New Orleans, we've had some flash flooding events, but we've also had some flooding events where we knew there was substantial rainfall, maybe upstate or maybe in other parts of the U.S., but we knew that the Mississippi River was going to wind up at flood stage, and they may wind up having to open the Bonacary spillway. Again, we're not as susceptible to flooding today because of the Mississippi River as we were in the 1920s, 1930s, when there was catastrophic flooding that claimed significant numbers of lives in Louisiana. 1927 was that flood. Let's see, what else do we want to be sure and talk about? It is 75% of the federally declared disasters. And what that really tells you is flooding and spring flooding in particular is a common threat that we face and a common hazard that we deal with. And so again, how do we manage the vulnerability associated with that hazard? Some of the ways that we can do that includes elevating our home outside of the flood plain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in mitigation strategies. And again, runoff absorption and flood control measures are some of the ways that we either help control or in some cases lose control of flooding situations. This is just one example. Again, this is an image from here in New Orleans. If I'm not mistaken, this was 2018 or 2019 with a tropical storm. And actually it was a band from a tropical storm that didn't actually come ashore here. This was just an outer band of the tropical storm itself. And again, just signals the fact that our pumping system in New Orleans cannot keep up with substantial rainfall in a short period of time. It will pump it out over several hours, but it does take several hours for the pumps to be able to catch up with the amount of rainfall that can be collected in New Orleans at times. Let's see, let's actually talk just a little bit about, I think I've shown you this image before, but it helps you understand how levees were created long before men came or people came to the Mississippi River Basin who felt like they needed to do things to try and control the flooding the Mississippi River. And so this is called a levee. Well, actually there are natural levees that build up over time, over years, hundreds of years. And that's why the riverbanks close to the Mississippi River are actually the highest points in the New Orleans area. Our home is only a couple of blocks from the Mississippi River, and we're actually about 8 foot above sea level, which is substantially different than a number of homes in New Orleans, but again, just reminds us of how, again, through hundreds of years of water rising and falling around the Mississippi River, natural levees were created and natural sediment was deposited and built up. And that's what created those high riverbanks to begin with. And then we've since come along through engineering and substantially raised those levees with man-made levees to further control the flooding of the Mississippi River. And so if you know a little bit about where the water table is, and then what can happen with pulling some of the water out and then lowering that water table, that's actually to some extent what occurred here in terms of draining the swamp area that's really all around where the campus here is at the University of New Orleans. A lot of this 100 years ago was mostly swampland. And so, you know, there were thousands of people dying each year of yellow fever and mosquitoes. And to be able to kill the habitat for the millions of mosquitoes that lived in these swamplands, they drained the swamps. But in draining the swamps, obviously that creates if you suck all of the water out of a sponge, what happens to it? It gets smaller. And so that's why this land area now is well below sea level. But it's also why we don't have, you know, even hundreds or thousands of people dying of malaria and yellow fever each year as well. But that's also, you know, that's also a challenge that we have with flooding because of how we've changed the water table by moving water out of the higher areas of the water table. Let's see. This gives you just a little bit of an idea of how a natural floodplain occurs, and then a fully developed floodplain in terms of how we wind up with man-made structures to try and control flooding. Now, part of the challenge with man-made structures controlling flooding, that may work 75, 85, even 90% of the time, but there's got to be some space to allow for natural flooding to occur, because no matter how substantial you engineer something, you're going to have a very difficult time trying to engineer something to the extent that you can control all of the flooding that may occur in any given high density metropolitan area. You've got to have places for the water to go. And again, one of the solutions here in the 1920s was the construction of the Bonnet-Carré Spillway, which does allow for water to be emptied out of the Mississippi River and into Lake Pontchartrain, which again substantially reduces the threat of flooding to the city of New Orleans, but unfortunately dumps a lot of fresh water into what's another otherwise brackish water type ecosystem, and so kills a number of fish, crabs, things that live in what's considered brackish water. And so the point this is making is when there's wetlands, there is a place for the water to go. And when there's wetlands, there's a place to absorb the water. A part of the effort to try and rebuild wetlands south of New Orleans is to create some absorption for future hurricanes. You know, we've lost a substantial amount of wetlands all across Plaquemines Parish, St. Charles Parish, but areas, Jefferson Parish for that matter, but areas south of us between us and the Gulf of Mexico. And as we continue to lose those wetlands, the greater the chance is that we could wind up with substantial amounts of storm surge that could devastate the city in future disasters. And so this kind of gives you an idea of how sand allows for substantial absorption and clay does not. There's a lot of runoff associated with clay. And so it's what type of soil texture or soil composition is out there will depend on how much either absorption or how much runoff you have. And then what type of protection opportunities are there, whether it's there's a number of places around New Orleans, and I've got some of those. So I've got some image, if I'm not mistaken, I've got some image pictures coming up. Let me go ahead and flip to them. So this is an example of diking an area downstream from where people had been killed. Thousands of people had been killed multiple times because of different floods. And so in China, what they did was they built a series of dikes, which are dams to control the flooding off of the Han River, also known as the Yellow River, but it's a substantial river. And again, the point is to look for ways to control the amount of water flow downstream. If you can control it, it's a lot easier to at least manage how much flow takes place. And so another example is the Old River Complex, and this is in Louisiana. It's north of Baton Rouge, and this is again channeling water into the Atchafalaya from the Mississippi. And the concern was the Old River Control Complex was designed to create a 70-30 divide with 30% of the water going into the Atchafalaya, because the concern was as more water flowed into the Atchafalaya, it could wind up being 40, 50, 60%, and ultimately rechanneling the Mississippi and taking over the Atchafalaya Basin, becoming the Mississippi River, which again has a catastrophic effect on every area south of the Old River Complex, but substantially New Orleans. Our freshwater intake requires us to be able to pull water out of the Mississippi River. If there's not fresh water coming down the Mississippi River, what you'll have is you'll have backflow of water from the Gulf of Mexico, and that water's, even if it's mixing with fresh water, it's going to be brackish water, and desalination, taking salt out of the water, is not a system that exists right now with the water plants that primarily pull water from the Mississippi River. This is a channelization image from California, but as you'll notice, particularly in Jefferson Parish, but also in Orleans Parish, we have a number of these channels that have been constructed. And the point is to be sure that there's places that we can direct runoff, and in some cases we pump water out of the channels and into lift water out of the channels and into Lake Pontchartrain in most cases. Frequent flooding in New Orleans, again, because the water table, the clay subsoil, more than about 50% of the area was reclaimed land where we drained the swamp. This kind of gives you an idea of the topography of the highest point in the Orleans area, and that's over at the Mississippi River. And really the lowest point is between the Gentilly Ridge and out here at UNO. And so a number of areas that are particularly in New Orleans East, but also in the Gentilly area between here and back toward Interstate 610, those are some of the lowest areas in the parish. And this gives you an idea of the swamp area. And this is 165, 170 years ago, how much of the area was swamp and then what type of channels existed at that time. And this was, again, as they recognized the importance of trying to further build channels to drain some of the swamp water, but they still didn't fully understand how mosquitoes, how the habitat, if you destroy the habitat, you substantially reduce the number of mosquitoes that can pass on malaria and yellow fever. But that was an effort that was underway and that was poorly understood in the 1840s, but clearly understood by 1910, and that's why it became a substantial part of the focus. So this is the drainage system in 1903. As you'll notice, we still use a number of the pumps and a number of the pump systems that were a part of this original 1903 system that actually was created in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In many cases, they've refurbished some of this equipment, and I'm told some of the equipment is just as good as if it was being produced tomorrow. I can't really imagine that's the case in every circumstance, but you know, I certainly don't know as much about it as the people who work on it, so I have to trust that if that's what they believe, then I guess that works. But this does give you an idea of something called a screw pump, and we have approximately 197 of these that are used to pump water and transfer water. Probably the best place to get a visual of just how much water is pumped at a number of different places around the city. But as if you're on Interstate 10 and you're traveling in toward the city, just beyond where 610 splits and heads toward the northern part of the city, and Interstate 10 continues on toward the Superdome, if you'll notice over to your right, there's a significant number of discharge pipes where water has been lifted out of either mid-city and is being pushed out to channels to take it out to Lake Pontchartrain. And here's, again, just I think this is on the Industrial Canal, but it again gives you an idea of just how much flood control capacity has been constructed around New Orleans to, again, pump substantial amounts of water from one part of the city, lower parts of the city, out to channels that'll push it out to Lake Pontchartrain. This is, again, just giving you an idea of how substantial these pump systems are. This is just to the east of the city, looking back. And what you're seeing is, again, this substantial structure that's a part of the $14 billion system that was put in place after Hurricane Katrina to strengthen the levee system and to strengthen the pump system. This is actually a channel that is channel control, and it can be opened and closed to help manage storm surge with a hurricane approaching. This is just another image of, again, if I'm not mistaken, this is now west of the city, looking back toward the city, but is, again, just a reminder of just how much substantial infrastructure has been built to try and control and try and manage flooding in and around the city, and certainly manage storm surge that can be pushed into the city with a future hurricane. So types of flooding, so there's really 4 types of flooding: saturation, flash flooding, storm surge, and some type of a levee failure. Let's kind of go through each of these just a minute. So with floods in general, a part of it's understanding, what's causing the flooding. And again, what type of soil composition is there. If it's snowfall, I actually have a different image for that. This is also a picture from here in New Orleans, but it does give us an idea of just how quickly we can be overwhelmed with water and our need to be able to pump it out quickly. So with saturation flooding, there's relentless rainfall that occurs in a given area. And again, no matter how much no matter how permeable the soil may be, such as we've said before, sand is far more permeable than clay. At some point, there's a saturation point. And if there's substantial rainfall, like we saw with Hurricane Harvey around the Houston area 2 years ago, it just saturates the area and there's no place for the water to go. And so, again, that leads to substantial amounts of flooding. We also saw that in 1993 with the Mississippi River. Now, this is an area that shows water features, and this this area that is identified as underwater is northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. And there's no lake there. That just shows you how much of the area was underwater because of saturation flooding that had occurred. And 1993 was considered one of the most substantial disasters associated with river flooding on the Mississippi in 100 years. In fact, it was referred to as a 500-year storm, but unfortunately, there's been several storms over the last 25, 50 years that have been referred to as 500-year storms. And what that really means is the likelihood of that a storm occurring is 1 every 500 years. The reality is it's caused people that do actuarial forecasting for insurance companies to go back and recalibrate what their assumptions are, because if you have multiple occurrences that are considered once every 500 years, it tells you some of your assumptions are off, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so this also gives you an idea of just how much river flooding took place around St. Louis. This shows you just a little bit more of the saturation associated with that. Actually, I'm sorry, this is Hurricane Floyd. Hurricane Floyd was a massive storm that moved up the coast of Florida, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and did similar damage to what Hurricane Harvey did. It dropped between 20 and 30 inches of water, of rain in an area that, again, the water table is very shallow, and there's just not a lot of topography for runoff. And so it cut off a number of communities for an extended period of time. Let's also talk a little bit about flash flooding. We're not as prone to what the true definition of flash flooding is. We have some flash flooding in the New Orleans area, but because we have so much flooding and because we have such an elaborate pump system, it's not as overwhelming as you would see in, such as if you're living in California, as an example. What exacerbates flooding in California is the type of wildfires they have that burn off a lot of the vegetation. And then before some of the vegetation gets a chance to grow back, they may have a substantial rainfall, and that substantial rainfall, now there's no vegetation to hold the rainfall, and that can lead to a substantial amount of runoff, causing flash flooding. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about? And these are just some images of flash flooding. I did include an image, a couple of images of ice jam flooding. Again, that's not something I've experienced, and unless you're from an area that has a lot of cold weather, it's a little bit unusual, but it is a normal occurrence in places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, up around the Great Lakes area. And so, you know, what I would tell you is ice jam flash flooding is something that's a threat. And if it's something that you live in that area, this is something I would certainly pay a little bit of attention to. And this is just an example of an ice jam flood. And again, as you can tell, you wind up with cycles of where it warms up and it breaks up into pieces, and then it may cool back down and freeze some of the pieces, But what happens is you have all of these floating pieces of ice. As they move downstream, they may find this constricting point and it starts to pile up. And as it piles up, it creates an ice jam, or it artificially dams an area, and then water backs up behind it, causing flooding in that area. Storm surge, we've talked a lot about storm surge. I've got some additional animation here to help you understand how, again, water is lifted around a hurricane, and also how a hurricane pushes air across the top of the water. That wind-driven, pressure-driven storm surge. And then compounding that includes wave activity. Also compounding that includes sea level that may be associated with tides. Yeah, and so the compounding components of high tide, storm surge, the wave action can lead to flooding and inundation. The other piece to know about is if this occurs during a full moon, high tides are more profound than a new moon high tide. And I did include a little bit of, if you want to understand some of the hydraulics or the mathematical equations behind storm surge, I did include a little bit of that information, but that's not something you'll be tested on. But if you're curious, it's there. And so the last one is dam or dike failure, levee failure. You know, and it shouldn't be a surprise that if we look at the last 100 years or the last 30 years, the most substantial dam failure or levee failure occurred here in New Orleans. And again, it gets back to Hurricane Katrina. A lot of people think about Katrina in the context of it being this substantial natural disaster. And if you lived in Mississippi, it was a substantial natural disaster. But if you lived in New Orleans, the storm that came through here was entirely survivable. The challenge that it posed was it inundated and overwhelmed the levee system that was here and breached levees in 47, 45 places. And because there were so many breaches and so many levee failures, again, it was more of a man-made catastrophe here and more of a natural disaster in Mississippi. Now, you can always argue that the natural disaster caused the man-made disaster. But again, it just reminded us that it's paramount for us to construct a very strong, very capable, very capable levee system. And as I've been told multiple times by people who are far more the expert dealing with the levee system here in New Orleans, they use the word safer. We are far safer than we were in 2004. We are safer than certain cities like Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami, Mobile. But we're not completely safe. And his point by saying we're not completely safe is, you know, they spent $14 billion on the system, which is an awful lot of money, and a great deal of work was done. But honestly, some of the recommendations, had they built some of the systems that were recommended, they could have spent closer to $50 billion. So again, it reminds you that a lot of money has been spent and a lot of effort has been made to minimize future risk here in the New Orleans area, but nevertheless, there's still some risk here. I did include, just for examples, some dam failures leading to flash floods. Probably the most catastrophic in the United States was the Jonestown flood, May 31st of 1889. I did include a small video clip of that also on the landing page. And this gives you just a little bit of the background on it. It was a large earthen dam that they had constructed for the purpose of creating a hunt club that was high socialites that participated in the hunt club. Obviously, it wasn't open. It was a very exclusive type of membership, and over time there was some neglect to the dam, and there was substantial rainfall. The rainfall overtopped this earthen dam and quickly eroded it, and then pushed a substantial amount of water down into the valley below. Well, the town of Jonestown, which at the time was a population of 15 to 20,000 people, was overwhelmed with water. And so you wound up with thousands of people losing their lives in really just a matter of hours when the dam failed. This gives you an idea of the path of the flood. This is just some images. 2009 were killed. Again, I've seen, I have a couple of books that were written at that time, and I do find it interesting. Again, one of the books talks about between 10 and 12,000 people being killed. Again, the more realistic number is believed to be closer to 2,000 to 3,000. But it does give us an idea of just how substantial the damage was and how catastrophic it was. And certainly this image gives you a little bit more of that. This, again, reminds you of just how the water rushed down through the middle of town. And so let's kind of fast forward to another flooding event that I want to be sure and mention. There was a tropical storm that settled in northern Virginia, and with, just as we saw tropical weather that actually impacted Florida, caused substantial flooding in New Orleans. Well, there was a tropical storm in November of 1977 that mostly dissipated over Western Virginia, but a large cell developed over Western North Carolina that caused a substantial amount of rainfall. And the water running out of the mountains in the North Carolina mountains actually flowed down into South Carolina and flowed down into Georgia. And this ongoing substantial rainfall dropped 10, 11, 12, and 14 inches of rain. And when it rains that much in the mountains, the water runs downhill very quickly, and so it can lead to flash flooding. November the 7th, 1977, further downstream was a dam called the Kelly Barnes Dam. It was overtopped and water flowed into a town down below the dam. And the town was in northern Georgia called Toka Falls. There were students at Toka Falls College, and approximately 50 people were killed, and most of them were in a couple of dorms there at Toka Falls College. Now, let's kind of think about our time frame here. In 1977, who was president? The president was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter had previously served as the governor of the state of Georgia, and his home was the state of Georgia. And his wife, Rosalind, is actually pictured in this image. She was actually one of the first representatives of the federal government on the scene. And the fragmented federal response in the president's home state really led to the creation of FEMA. Again, as much as we saw, at least in my opinion, a fragmented response with FEMA here in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, there was certainly a challenging federal response in the aftermath of the Toka Falls disaster. These are some additional images. And again, it just gives you an idea of just how substantial and how quickly something like this can happen. Again, during a flood, if it's a flash flood watch, understand the signs. If it's a flash flood warning, you may only have minutes to act and act immediately. Know where you are and know where you are in context with what the risk is or what the threat is. Again, we have a lot of flooding in the New Orleans area, but we have a substantial system here to pump the water out. It's typically not an overwhelming threat other than when there's substantial levee failure. And so as long as the levees are intact and the pump systems are working the way they're supposed to, we will have flooding. We'll continue to have flooding for the foreseeable future, but we also have a means to address it and try and deal with it. But again, in any type of flooding, the solution is always to head to higher ground, move away from the floodwaters. Certainly listen to what's going on. If you need to evacuate, try not to walk through flooded waters. If you see moving water across a road, it's important not to drive through moving water. And there's a couple of points there. First of all, you don't know what's under the water. You don't know how much of the road may have been washed away. And the second piece there is you would really be surprised, particularly with smaller vehicles, how moving water can actually float a vehicle and move it off of the highway very quickly. Pay attention to barricades. Don't drive around barricades. If you'll notice on particularly bridges or tunnel type areas, there are markers on the side that give you an idea of how high the water may be if there's water already in the area. Again, if you can't see what you're driving in, don't drive in it. Turn around. And actually the saying is turn around, don't drown. Yeah. So this other, let's see. The point I'll make on this one picture here, after the floodwaters recede. So this looks pretty bizarre. This is actually Interstate 40 in North Carolina after Hurricane Florence. There was so much flooding in the area that, and then the waters receded quite quickly. I've actually got some video of the highway patrol, or the state troopers, calling for fire trucks to come out and wash fish out of the road that had, as the floodwaters had quickly receded, it left a number of fish on the highway. Again, just pretty bizarre stuff, but it also reminds you that once the floodwaters recede, there may be damage, there may be contamination. Just don't assume things are okay. And obviously, floodwaters and electricity don't mix very well. As far as a business continuity plan, again, what type of flood hazards do you have? Understanding the regulations, what type of education can you offer your employees? And then abatement or mitigation, what are things that you can do to manage your vulnerabilities to the hazard? We know flooding is a hazard for the greater New Orleans area. So if you know that, if that's a known hazard, how do you manage your vulnerability to it? And again, floodplain management is one of those. Part of that includes design. How do you design your structures, and where do you place items if you know there's flooding in the forecast? What type of personal preparedness do you have? Again, understanding what your risks are, and particularly where you live and what type of impact that may be. Again, from a business standpoint, critical equipment, utilities. I used to live in a town called Goldsboro, North Carolina, and I remember my next door neighbor spending about 12 hours moving a bunch of items out of his business. And he told me, he said, we've been through this before. He said, my business, we're far enough downstream that with the amount of flooding that's happened, it's going to be underwater in about 24 hours. And he was right, actually. In about 18 hours, his business was completely underwater. But fortunately, he had enough previous experience, and he also had enough knowledge to take the things out of his business that he knew he would need to reconstitute the business and restart it once the flooding subsided. We can't control the geography. We can't control the topography. We can control how we live and work in the floodplain. We can certainly understand floodplain management and what are things that we can do to keep ourselves safe. And I guess the main point to this is, again, flooding is a substantial threat to us, particularly here in New Orleans, but all across Louisiana. You know, the 1927 flood in Louisiana was substantial. About a third of the farmland was underwater at one point. Aaron Neville has a song called Louisiana, and he talks about, it's more of a ballad that talks about some of the flooding that occurred in 1927. But there have been other cycles of substantial flooding, particularly in New Orleans, but in other parts of the state as well. And that's why we have as much flood control equipment as we do. So we're not as prone to the devastation that we once saw with flooding, but we are still prone to the risk associated with it. And it's still a hazard, and therefore we still have a vulnerability to it. Maybe not as much as we once did, but it's still here, and it's still a clear and present danger that we need to deal with. And with that, let's wrap it up. So if you have any questions, be sure and send me an email, but this should do it for the day. Again, we'll keep an eye on what's going on with the online testing system with FEMA. If it continues to be problematic, we'll regroup on what our due dates are and exactly what's due in the coming days, or for that matter, the coming weeks. Okay, I don't have anything else. Let me stop the share and say until next week, I'll see you here on Zoom.